Tax Advisory Commission to order. Will you, Commission Aide White, will you do the quorum check now, or shall I read protocol?
If you could proceed with the introductory remarks just regarding the general matter of the meeting, and then I'll do a quorum call.
Gotcha. Pursuant to the emergency proclamation issued by Governor David E. Gay on October 1st, 2021, related to the state's COVID-19 Delta response, in order to allow public participation in a manner consistent with social distancing practices, the following procedures are in effect for the meeting. Members of the public will not be allowed into the meeting room, but may view the meeting on a live broadcast via the WebEx internet platform or via recording once available on the Commission's website. Remote testimony will be accepted on all items from persons registered to speak by video conference or by phone following opening remarks and administrative announcements. If you would like to present oral testimony remotely, please register through the WebEx internet platform. Written testimonies, including the testifier's address, email address, and phone number, will be available to the public on the Commission's website. As a courtesy, please turn off all cell phones for the duration of the meeting. Roll call. Commission Aide George White, would you please call the roll to confirm the attendance of commissioners at this meeting and the presence of a quorum?
Yes, Chair. Chair Mould, present virtually.
Here.
Thank you. Vice Chair Wong,
Present.
present in person. Commissioner Bean,
Present.
present in person. Commissioner Legal.
Present virtually.
Thank you, Commissioner Legal. Commissioner Aki Peters.
Present.
Commissioner Peters is present in person. Commissioner Fu Pham,
Present virtual.
present virtually. And Commissioner Stormo Gibson is not currently present, but you do have a quorum, your Chair. So I will keep an eye out for Commissioner Stormo Gibson, but you do have a quorum. You can proceed.
Thank you. Given the presence of a quorum, let us continue on with our agenda and the business of the Commission. For those commissioners participating from outside of the council chamber, under the governor's proclamation, the meeting will automatically recess if we lose audiovisual contact with you and cannot reconvene until we reestablish contact. Therefore, please announce beforehand if you will be voluntarily signing out of the meeting. Members, before you are the minutes of our September 27th, 2021 meeting, which supplement the video recording of that meeting available on the Commission's website. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the September 27th, 2021 meeting?
I move to accept the minutes.
Is there a second?
Second.
Absent objection to this motion, do we have unanimous consent to approve said minutes?
Yes.
No objection.
No
With
objection.
unanimous consent, so ordered. We will now proceed to the remote testifiers. To those coming in remotely, please video conference from a quiet location and mute your television. Also, be sure that your microphones and cameras are in working order. For those joining us by phone, we will identify you by your phone prefix. If technical issues arise, I will give you a few moments to try to resolve minor connection issues. However, if it cannot be resolved, I will have to move on to the next testifier. When I call your name, please state your full name and the agenda item or items you are testifying on. Speakers are limited to a 1-minute presentation on each item. When the timer goes off, please conclude your remarks promptly. I will close testimony once all remote speakers have testified. Okay, do we have anyone coming in remotely who would like to testify? I see
Mr. Tom Gearing.
Hello, Mr. Tom Gearing. You have the floor.
Mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Mr. Gearing.
All right. Yes, I was in contact with Commissioner Calvin Pham, who asked me to comment on the land value tax proposal for a study to be conducted. And I'd like to comment on that. There are several study objectives that were outlined. I think you're familiar with those. Is that correct? On
We
that
have-
value tax?
Yeah, we've circulated some materials on this. Are they in those materials, Commissioner Pham?
Yes.
We are familiar with those, yes.
Okay, good. Would you like me to comment on those, or is there some other questions that you might have?
So this is regarding the proposal to conduct a study for the land value tax. And
That's right.
what jurisdiction are you? You're coming from Multnomah County, Portland,
Yes,
Oregon?
Portland, Oregon. That's correct.
Great. Well, I mean, if you have any high-level comments, we'd appreciate them. Otherwise, I'll open it up to commissioners to ask any questions they may have of you. But my understanding is you are a subject matter expert on land value taxation. Is that correct?
Well, you might say that. I've been involved with land value tax for quite a number of years, and I'm the research director for our Georgia's group called Common Ground. We have a chapter. It's a national organization for that's part of even an international movement to propose land value taxation. We have quite a different tax structure in Oregon than you have in Hawaii. You might be familiar with something about Oregon, but we have limited assessments, and you don't. You base your tax rates on true market value, which is a much better thing than what we have. So the study that was done, which I think you're familiar with, by the Northwest Economic Research Center at Portland State University, I think that's what you're basing your ideas on for a land value tax study. We commissioned that study a few years ago, and came out with some very positive recommendations. So we're very happy about the results of the study. We encourage you to take on a study of the land value tax as well. There are a number of points, though, that come up in the study objectives that I'd like to comment on or clarify. I don't know if you have your draft in front of you.
I can pull it up.
We do have.
Oh, yeah, and then take a look at these. There are several bullet points, and I'd like to comment on each one. The first one is to model the effects of a land value tax using data localized. You see that one? Okay. Well, actually, what you'll be doing is modeling tax shift effects of a change to the land value tax. So what you want to be doing is making comparisons between a land value tax modeling results with the current property tax system that you have, which is an equal rate system. And of course, you would use data localized to Honolulu County, which I presume you would have, tax assessors data. You would make those comparisons. So I think you want to emphasize that. Secondly, the bullet determine the land value tax rates for existing property classification. I'm not clear about what is meant by that. That was confusing to me. Are you looking at determining the effective land value tax rate, which is a measure that economists use typically, but it's not very well understood by the public. So I'm not sure how you want to handle that. Property tax classifications, I'm not sure what you mean by that. And I would ask the question, does the state of Hawaii allow different classes of land use to be taxed at different rates? Is that
Yes.
correct? Is that correct? That's correct?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, well, that would be in violation of Oregon State Constitution, which requires uniform taxation. We kind of support that idea. The idea of taxing different land uses at different rates could open up the possibility of competition between various land users. I don't know whether you have that experience, but can you tell me if residential land is taxed at a different rate from commercial?
It is.
Higher or lower?
Lower.
It's a lower rate, and that's fixed where? Is that fixed in Constitution, or is that just a statute?
Statute.
That's a statute.
Or a county ordinance, actually.
Okay.
Technically.
That's not unusual. Some states do that. That's okay. But as I say, it could open up the possibility of commercial interests in trying to get their rate lower too. I know that if that were to occur in Oregon, it would just open up a can of worms. So we're satisfied that that doesn't occur.
Okay.
So I'll just go on to the next point.
May I ask how many points there are, Mr. Gearing? Because I don't think we necessarily need to go down each point. I think we're going to have time to sort of take a look at the study. But I was just wanting to maybe open it up for questions from commissioners.
Okay.
That they may have,
do that.
or if there's something really important that you want to say, like what's the most important thing about this you would want to say?
Well, there are a number of points on here, but let's just open this up, and then some of these points might come up.
Great.
If you open up the questions.
Chair Mold, I have a question for Mr. Gehring. Maybe this would, Mr. Gehring, my name is Commissioner Jack Legal. I'm virtually present. The question that I have is from your opening statement, is that we have a different taxation in Honolulu and in Oahu, with all the different classifications and things like that. So my question is, do you think, in your experience and knowing our tax classification here, do you think the land value tax would benefit us?
I do, and here I think this is one of the main points. The land value tax produces incentives, and the main incentives are to develop at a higher density infill development in centrally located areas. That is where the land value tax incentives are the strongest. They are not as strong in outlying single-family neighborhoods. You probably experienced that. And where I think Calvin raised an issue, whether equally land value properties with different improvement values would be a disadvantage. That is, the lower value homes. The point there is the tax effects would be fairly minimal in the outlying neighborhoods. The tax effects, the incentives effects would be much greater in central areas where there are high values, high land values. What you will find is that underutilized properties, vacant, and perhaps surface parking lots would see an incentive to develop their properties, either develop or sell so that it can be developed to higher, better use. That is where you're going to find your biggest effects.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other commissioners? Questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm still trying to really wrap my mind around this land value taxation. If we have this land value taxation, as I understand the way it is explained is that in Hawaii, we now tax the whole thing, the land plus the improvement over in the land, the buildings and everything. The total assessment is based on, but when we go into land value tax only, we're only going to pay on the value of the land, right?
No.
Without the buildings?
Yeah, okay. What typically is done, and this is, I think Pennsylvania sets the model for this. The assessments are taxed at different rates, both the land and improvement. There is no pure land value tax that I'm aware of in this country. There is in Germany as a local option. But in this country, what we have is a split rate tax. A higher tax rate on land and a lower tax rate on improvements. And you can vary that. And in fact, I would suggest that a phase-in over a period of, say, 10 years occur where the tax rate on land would be, say, 55 to 60% of the total tax rate. And that the buildings would be, say, 40% of the tax rate would be on land, on improvements. That would change over a period of years where you'd ratchet up the tax rate on land, where you reach perhaps 90, 95% of the rate on land, and say 10 to 5% would be on improvements. That would be done over a period of time in order to minimize the shock to some property owners of a jump in taxation, property taxes, those which have a high land to improvement ratio. In fact, it's the ratio of land to improvements that determines the outcome of a land value tax. If the total county rate, say, is, or the ratio is, say, 40% on land, that is total, all the assessments of properties in the county, if 40% of the total value is in land and 60% is improvements, which is fairly typical, and is fairly stable through a period of time. It certainly is in Oregon and Washington. If that becomes the fulcrum for the tax shift, so if any individual property has an assessment on land, which is, say, 50% or 60% of the assessment on land, they would see a tax shift upwards. And those typically higher density sites with a low improvement or low land assessment compared to improvements, they would see a downward shift in taxation. That's basically how it works.
Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Gehring.
So as I understand it, the way we assess tax, we have a land assessment and an improvement assessment, and then we apply one rate, the same rate to that combined assessment.
No, for a land value tax, it would be a split rate, two
Right.
rates. What you have now is a single rate.
So the proposal would be to have a study, right, that would model out different percentages to see what the incidence of that tax would be on various classes of folks.
You could do that, yes.
on that.
You've seen the what we call the NERC study, Northwest Economic Research Center. You've seen that, and they modeled. They did a 60%, which would be a beginning shift, 60% tax on land assessments, and a 90% on land assessment. You could do that. You could do both. It's up to you as to what you'd want to do there. But you compare it to your equal weight system now, what the tax incidence would be on various classes of property, basically, is what they did.
Got it. Mr. Gearing, are you familiar with the Lincoln Institute on Land Policy?
Yes, I certainly am.
What is your assessment of their work?
Oh, they do very fine work. They do very, very expert work.
Thank
and
you.
Of course, yes, yeah, they do.
Interesting.
Commissioner Pham.
Yes, Mr. Daring, I first wanted to thank you. That's the first time we've actually been able to communicate sort of face-to-face here. So we've been exchanging email communications, and Mr. Daring has provided the Rates and Classifications Committee with some of the proposal work behind that NERC study that we have been looking at as a commission. So that was the background behind the list that the Rates and Classifications Subcommittee came up with that Mr. Gearing was referencing earlier, but we'll get to that whenever we get to our report. One thing that we had public testimony about at the last meeting was about the cost of doing such a study. And in the materials that Mr. Gearing provided, the proposed cost was $35,000, and that was paid for with foundation funding.
That's right.
How do you think that compares to a study for us here in Honolulu? What did that $35,000 pay for?
That's a good question. Are you looking at a study for the entire county?
Ideally,
yeah. So, yeah.
So, yeah.
Mhm.
Probably would, yeah. Depends on who does it, but if I think it would be within that range, 35,000. Now, one thing that is going to happen when you do a study, I don't know what your county assessor's data looks like, but
Mhm.
typically, you get assessor's data, it's going to be it's going to need to be cleaned.
Yep.
There are going to be some anomalies in it. Maybe there will be split lots, something like this. And when you deal with condominiums, that's another whole problem. And so it took NERC actually about 3 weeks, at least 3 weeks, to clean up the data so it could be used. Because the data is not, the data is not prepared by the assessor for analytical work. You have to really dig into that, clean it up before you can actually use it. And that could take some time. So depending on what the data looks like, the cost may go up or it may go down.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Thank you.
One other question I have, if you all don't mind, Mr. Gearing. So I keep seeing reference to what the land value tax and Waikiki development in Hawaii as a cautionary tale of some sort. Are you familiar with the history and background of that?
I only saw the NERC study, and I was aware that Hawaii did abandon land value tax. I'm not sure what the land value tax looked like, but it was abandoned, in 1970? Because of a fear of promoting too much development. What I think is that it depends on what the central area looks like. If there's a significant amount of vacant or underutilized land, that could be redeveloped, I think the land value tax is the perfect instrument to make that happen because the incentives to develop are there. That's, I think, what that's.
And you're really talking
the
about
contingency.
infill development, correct?
Yes, it is. It would be infill. Plus, there is another aspect to the land value tax, which I think is very important. And that if it's a uniform tax, it's going to tax all property within the county using a land value tax will have the effect of putting a damper on land price inflation. That's very important. And that's important for housing affordability. In the long run, a tax on land could push down sales prices on land. And not push them down absolutely, but it would slow the growth of land property, residential land prices. As you know, properties have been escalating in price recently. Nationwide, that just in the last year, home values have increased 16%. This is phenomenal, and it's really dangerous for this kind of land price inflation to continue over any period of time. It'll just knock out housing affordability altogether. But a land value tax, if it's high enough, will dampen that land price inflation over a period of time. That's one of the major aspects of it. It also discourages land speculation. And I don't know to what extent that is a problem in Honolulu.
Big one.
If it's a big one, definitely the land value tax will discourage holding on to properties for windfalls, gains on sale. But that again is because that's going to happen in the central area. It's not going to happen much to a great extent in outlying areas.
Okay.
Uh,
Mr. Chair, can I have one last question? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
One of the things that Calvin found brought up was that whether you want to eventually, after a study is done, apply it to the central core rather than the entire county. That's a good possibility. I think you could take a look at that, and that might work. I would be cautious, however, because if the ratio of land to improvements in the central core is very different from the county as a whole, it could distort the incentive effects. We found that here locally. We did a study for Metro on some commercial corridors, and we recommended against making having revenue neutrality at that small core level. So revenue neutrality at the county level is better if you can do that. Even if you select an application to the core area specifically, I would try to tie the revenue neutrality at the county level rather than at that level. You can do that, but that that could follow a study. The study, you can do the study on the entire county.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Gearing, for your testimony today and providing us with your expertise. May I ask? I hope you'll be if we have more questions of you as our work proceeds. I hope we'll be able to reach out to you with those. Would that be okay?
That would certainly be fine. I'd be happy to pitch in whatever I could.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Unless other commissioners have questions, let us move on to the next testifier.
Yes, Chair. Mr. Dennis Tanimoto.
Mr. Tanimoto, you have the floor.
I will not be testifying orally. I submitted written testimony.
Thank you. We have received it.
Yes, we have. Thank you, Mr. Tanimoto. If I can just confirm, the other individuals, I believe a couple have mentioned in the chat that they are just observing. Mr. Jacob Taddy. Mr. Taddy, are you testifying or just observing?
Just observing as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Just observing, Chair. And Mr. Brandon Sakia.
He doesn't have a mic. He's just observing.
Thank you very much. And Chair, I would just also ask to note for the record that Commissioner Stormo Gibson is present and was present pretty much through the entire presentation of Mr. Gearing. And also Administrator Takara is present as well virtually. Chair, just for the record, if I can just briefly go over the written testimony submitted, just so that it's reflected in the video record of those that did submit testimony. In your packets, in your briefing packets, there is testimony from State Senator Stanley Chang, from Faith Action Housing Now, and I believe Ms. Carson will be giving a presentation regarding that matter. There's testimony from Arjuna Haim, Mr. John Kawamoto, Mr. Matthew Cohen, Young Progressives Demanding Action, Hawaii Children's Action Network Speaks, Aloha Pacific Federal Credit Union, Hawaii Credit Union League, which was Mr. Tanimoto, as well as individuals Sydney Bandy, Christine Samonte, and Esther Kim. And Chair, I believe that that is all the current testifiers that are present virtually. Mr. Kawamoto may be able to sign in at some point in the next half hour, so I will let you know if that's the case. And if you wish for him to provide oral testimony, you can proceed to do that, but we can proceed with the agenda and close testimony for now at your call.
Great, thank you very much. There being no other testifiers at this time, testimony is now closed.
Mr. Chair, Jack Legal.
Sorry, Commissioner Legal. Yes, sorry, I'm reopening testimony because Commissioner Legal is going to read testimony that he received from a constituent.
Actually, George, you mentioned about the Aloha Pacific, who submitted a written. Can I just summarize their thoughts or his thoughts on this one, or would that be enough?
Commissioner,
Go ahead.
The floor is yours.
Be okay. All right. So this written testimony, or this testimony, was actually I received from Vince Otsuka, who worked for Aloha Pacific Credit Union, and I'm just gonna read to you his different points. Maybe it's mentioned in his written testimony, but here they are. The mission: credit unions were established to help middle to low-class people access affordable banking products. Number 2, credit unions are not-for-profit cooperatives. All owners are members who are not publicly traded. Banks are owned by mainland investors. Third point, in 2016, credit unions started paying $1,000 per year for all properties occupied for credit union use, lease or own. Next point, there are currently 26 credit unions on the island of Oahu. Many of these credit unions are very small, operations with 2 to 5 employees. An increase in property taxes could significantly affect their ability to stay on business and keep their employees. Next point, for our credit union, the impact of removing our exemption equals to the salaries of about 10 employees. Charging 26 credit unions will not make a big impact on the city budget. The only way to do that is to remove the exemption for all nonprofits, especially larger nonprofits. And as a conclusion, this exemption makes a big difference for credit unions. It allows us to give back to our members in the form of higher deposit rates and lower loan rates. It also helps us hire additional employees to better service our members. Credit unions don't make the kind in income that bank makes because of our mission. We have very thin margin and need all the help we can get. Credit unions are direct competition with banks on the consumer side. If credit union goes away, banks will have less competition and more than likely will increase loan rates and charge more fees to fulfill the mission of maximizing profits for their shareholders. Mr. Chair, that's the end of the points from Vincent Soka. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Legal, and thanks to the testifier.
Chair, if I
now,
may, real quickly, there are two additional individuals just to confirm that they don't wish to testify. Ms. Karen Lee, do you wish to testify or are you just observing?
Yes, just observing.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. And a moniker noted as PSM, are you just observing or wishing to testify? And Chair, receiving no response, please proceed.
okay, now there being no other testifiers at this juncture, testimony is now closed. Commissioners, I would like to actually change our agenda. I would like to allow our presenters for today to now present. If there are no objections, I will pass it on to our first presenter. Okay, now turning to our presenters, it is with great pleasure and appreciation that I welcome Dr. Philip Garbadin, HCRC Professor in Affordable Housing, Economics, Policy, and Planning from the University of Hawaii's Department of Urban and Regional Planning and the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization. Dr. Garbadin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. So I have written remarks that I'll email out after the meeting. Apologies, I didn't get them in advance, but was doing them sort of last minute. I have a little PowerPoint, but it doesn't really show much, so it's more of a verbal presentation. But just for the sake of a visual, I'll put that up on the screen. I apologize in advance that I wasn't aware that the land value tax had gotten so much traction to the study. I did not incorporate it into my remarks for today. I think it's an excellent thing to study and has some real potential. So, but unfortunately, what I'll be talking about today is primarily this question of how to structure a progressive property tax system, for the benefits of the county. So let me begin with some definitions that I'll be using throughout my comments. First is an important distinction between property values and housing costs, and I'm sure this is all well known, but I'm just trying to clarify how I'm using the terms. To state the obvious, a property's value is what it will sell for in the open market, but its cost is what a household must pay each year to reside in that home. In the absence of taxes and renters, the two are obviously extremely closely related. The value of a home is simply a function of the price of housing and the quantity of those services represented by the property discounted over the lifetime of the property. The price itself is a function of the demand and supply for housing in the metropolitan region. Property taxes influence this relationship in interesting ways. The first step is that taxes directly raise the cost of housing. Because consumers are now asked to pay more for the same amount of housing, the demand for that housing will decline and those prices will decline, along with costs, although not enough to fully compensate for the new taxes. Finally, if the new taxes are spent on amenities, or to lower other taxes, hopefully you're not planning to throw the new revenue sources in the ocean, these benefits increase demand for housing in the metropolitan area by driving up values to some degree. The degree to which all of this happens is a source of significant empirical debate in economics, with estimates ranging fairly widely. Nevertheless, every quality study of housing taxes suggests that they do indeed raise costs and lower values, with the best estimates suggesting that between 20 and 50% of the tax gets absorbed as lower property values. I should note here that when I say lower property values, I don't necessarily mean that property values go down. In a market where appreciation has outpaced inflation, lower property values do not necessarily represent actual losses to homeowners, only that the rate of equity growth is less high than it would have been in the absence of the tax. For homeowners, this means that we should expect significant differences in the impact of increased property taxes between new and existing homeowners. Existing homeowners will pay higher costs and gain less equity in their home. New homeowners will be able to reap the benefits of lower housing values, reducing struggles to secure a down payment and mitigating the cost increase associated with the new tax. This is, of course, why raising property taxes is so politically challenging, but I suggest this scenario I described above is exactly something we should want to achieve given the state of Hawaii's housing market, particularly if the benefits and costs can be allocated in a progressive way. Right now, as we all know, the obscenely low property taxes in Hawaii interact with our state's perennial failure to construct homes proportional to demand, our state's natural amenities and land limits, and the federal government's highly favorable tax treatment of home ownership to make owning real estate an incredibly attractive investment on Oahu. This generates enormous benefits for existing property owners while making the attainment of home ownership increasingly impossible for low and moderate income families. So let's talk about how a progressive tax structure might be structured. We can start with the obvious. We should significantly increase the property taxes on any unit that does not house anybody. Whether that means seasonal homes, vacation rentals, or homes held vacant for investment, there is no reason not to discourage such uses through significantly higher taxes. The common concern is that properties do not sell instantly and thus a property may be taxed for sitting vacant while on the market. To me, this is an almost entirely fictitious problem. It is trivial to allow for a period of extended vacancy prior to triggering a vacant home tax, and any property on the market for more than 6 months should simply lower its price to what the market is willing to pay. Increasing the cost of not doing so is a perfectly appropriate policy goal. Now, I should be clear that I think this low-hanging fruit will not make an enormous difference, either in terms of revenue generated or housing values. The goal of the tax is, after all, to move properties back into the market, meaning that if a non-occupied housing tax is successful, it would produce no revenue. Moving to a much larger part of the market, let's consider properties that are occupied by their owners. As noted above, property taxes on homeowners will likely, 1, lower values relative to expected trajectories, 2, increase costs, 3, improve overall welfare. On net, these are desirable outcomes for the state, particularly if costs are increased for those who will not experience meaningful well-being impacts, and welfare is improved for those suffering most under the current system. But the degree to which a progressive tax on home ownership is able to achieve these goals is fundamentally based on how the tax is spread over the wealth distribution. Putting moral arguments to the side, the argument for any progressive taxation structure is generally based on the idea of declining marginal utility of income, which is a fancy way of simply saying that $1,000 is worth a lot more to me than it is to Mark Zuckerberg in terms of how it impacts our well-being. This is an entirely justified motivation, applies to all forms of taxation, but I would suggest that an efficient property tax system should be even more progressive than this principle would imply. This is for 2 reasons. First, property taxes are based on appraisals, and appraisals have been shown in many studies to be systematically biased. They tend to underestimate the value of very expensive homes, and they overestimate the value of more modest homes. The degree to which this occurs on Oahu is, I believe, something that should be carefully assessed sooner rather than later. Perhaps it already has, but I could not find any such study, so I'm sure you guys know of it if it exists. But insofar as it can be extremely difficult to regulate such biases out of the system, a progressive structure can be compensatory to these biases. As a stylized example, if we know that a modest house A will be appraised at 100% of its value, while a luxurious house will be appraised at 50% of its value, we could simply tax luxurious homes at 2 times the rate of modest homes if we were not able to rationalize the appraisal process. Second, property taxes are ultimately a form of a wealth tax, but they only tax a certain portion of a household's wealth, their real property. For low and moderate income homeowners, real estate is likely their only source of wealth, meaning that any increase in property taxes represents an equivalent tax on wealth. As one moves up the economic spectrum, however, real estate becomes a smaller and smaller portion of overall wealth. meaning that a total tax rate spread out over all of a household's wealth is lower. This makes property taxes somewhat regressive as a wealth tax. These two reasons are sometimes cited as reasons to avoid property taxation. I disagree. As policymakers, you are able to shape the progressive curve however you wish. Thus, the regressive tendencies of the property tax should push us to develop a tax structure that reflects these tendencies rather than casting away the idea entirely. Although a land value tax, I should say, is one way to resolve many of these issues. Thus, it is important to implement a sharply progressive property tax structure, one that leaves largely unchanged taxes on low and moderate value homes, but sharply taxes homes that represent some form of luxury consumption. For example, because we know that Zuckerberg's home is just a small fraction of his overall wealth, I know it's not in Oahu, but it's just an example, we should recognize that an aggressively high tax rate on luxurious homes will not impact many of their owners in a negative way. I should also note that a tax structure can also be made more progressive, not only by shifting the tax burdens, but also by shifting the amenities that the new tax pays for. If the tax is spent on things that benefit lower income households, it can improve the progressivity of the overall system. Finally, I want to turn to the sticky issue of rental housing. It is common for cities to make the politically expedient decision to tax rental housing at rates substantially higher than homeowners. After all, renters represent a minority of the electorate and vote in small numbers. Insofar as one can pretend that a tax on rental housing is solely a tax on landlords, such rental property tax increases align with standard populist antipathy towards landlords. But in short, increased taxes on rental housing on Oahu at this particular moment would be fundamentally harmful to poor and low-income households. Let me explain why. First, the empirical data suggests that landlords pass as much of the tax as possible onto their tenants. Not all of it, or even most of it, but serious estimates range between 15 and 50%. Thus, a tax on rental properties is also a tax on renters, who generally have low income and zero wealth. Clearly, this is ultimately regressive. And what I put on the screen right now is just the distribution of renter income and home ownership incomes, just to show you that there are very, very few what we would consider wealthy renters in the state. Second, the amount of the tax that cannot be passed on to tenants creates a disincentive for rental property ownership. Given that home prices and rents are currently in a stage of significant imbalance in the whole state, really in the whole country, the already existing pressures to sell rental properties into the home ownership market will be exacerbated. In other words, if a tax gradient is created between single-family homes leased as rentals and one occupied by a homeowner, or equivalently an apartment building and a condominium, we would expect to see conversion towards the more favorable tax treatment. Single-family rentals will be sold to homeowners and multifamily rentals converted to condos. Because Oahu has no market mechanism by which to replace those lost units, this will exacerbate the supply shortage in the rental market, at least in the short term. In textbooks, this is not problematic because the increased number of homeowners will decrease the number of renters, lowering prices back down to the rental market. But I think we all know that this is not true. The transition between renter and homeowner is not smooth. Lending policies and wealth inequalities create meaningful barriers to homeownership. Thus, any transition to rental properties into homeownership will result, at least partially, in the replacement of local renters with higher income households, rather than the promotion of current renters into homeownership. I am highly sympathetic to the idea that landlords on Oahu and in many American cities are able to leverage our perennial supply shortage to collect quote-unquote economic rents. This is a confusing term because it does not actually mean rents. It means inflated process due to artificial limits on competition and fundamental land shortages. In some cases, the way to address such rents is indeed efficiently to tax them away. But better would be to simply increase the supply of rental housing, both subsidized and non-subsidized. In my mind, the way to do this is to shift the tax gradient in a way that actually favors rental housing, ensuring that it is actually occupied year-round rental housing, while utilizing additional revenues from taxes on high-value properties to fund both the construction of new, deeply subsidized rental housing and providing programs to assist low-income renters to achieve home ownership. This in of itself will help reduce the economic rents collected by rental property owners and return the market to a more favorable place. It's certainly a utopian vision. Those end my remarks. I'll send the written version of this once I clean up the couple of typos that I noted. noticed while reading it aloud.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garboden. That was fascinating, and it really sounds like you've done your research and know it well. We're really lucky to have you here in Hawaii. With that, I'll open it up to questions from commissioners.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions. I should have said that, of course.
Thank you.
Question, Dr. Garboden. This is Jack Legal. Just really a lot of clarification. I think you have a very in-depth study on this on your presentation. What I get, generally speaking, from your presentation is wealth distribution through taxation. Am I correct, or kind of way up? That's what I got anyway.
I think the Zoom broke up. What was the summary?
The wealth distribution through taxation.
Yeah, I mean, I think some level of redistribution insofar as you are using the additional tax revenue to support households who are struggling the most under the current system. I think it's appropriate. I mean, it's not directly redistributive, but it's because remember, the goal of a progressive tax structure is not to over penalize the well-being of wealthy people, although it can be used that way if that seems politically viable. It's used to assure that everybody within the progressive tax structure is experiencing the same well-being loss from the tax, right? Because, you know, the actual amount that comes out of a bank account is less important than how much you need to adjust your quality of life to account for that taxation. So progressive taxation, as I've laid it out, accounts for that difference in what wealth means when you have $1 billion versus when you have, you know, $75 in your checking account. So the goal is to smooth out, to essentially flatten the well-being consequences of taxation. You know, if there is an explicit redistributive element, you could also increase the well-being loss at the higher income, and I have no problem with that as a social intervention.
Can I, Mr. Chair, can I just ask one more question of Dr. Garboden? So in this progressive tax structure, the proposal is really to tax the luxury properties, like for example in Kaka'ako, luxury condominiums, and tax them in a different structure, whatever it is, and then the lower properties, I would say maybe somewhere in the west area of Oahu, they have a different tax structure as well. Is that pretty much the gist of what I'm getting?
Yeah, the vision is very similar to, you know, your federal income tax, where as you pay X% on the first $200,000 of property value, with, you know, a slightly higher percentage on the next $200,000 of property value, and so on and so forth. So if you own it, I don't know what Zuckerberg's house is worth, but if you own a $10 million home, you're paying a significantly higher portion of your property value than if you own a $400,000 modest condo or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Doctor, this is Commissioner Wong here. Quick question. When you discuss the taxation of luxury properties, what are the indicators or what are the determining factors of what a luxury property is? Is that a value? Is it based on use? The proportion of the value to the property owner's income? Can you tell me what those factors would be?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $10 million question, right? I think everybody agrees that at a certain point, housing consumption no longer simply serves the needs of, serves the needs that a housing provides. It becomes a form of luxury consumption in the way that, a fancy car or lots of travel or so on and so forth. So it becomes purely a choice to spend more money because you just enjoy having a nice home and a nice place and all of those types of things. Where that threshold is, I think, is a very complicated thing, and I obviously avoided sort of assuming that. I think the kinds of study you were proposing for the land value tax is very much warranted to sort of figure out where those sweet spots are. To me, the question comes down to looking at whom is residing in homes of varying values, figuring out, essentially what are the income groups that we would expect to not suffer significant well-being implications from higher taxes. There's sort of, again, $10 million home seems like an obvious. Anyone in a $10 million home is able to pay a higher tax rate than they are paying right now. It becomes more contentious, and when you're dealing with a $2 million home or $3 million home, and those sort of liminal spaces where in our housing market things get so expensive. But I think there are data-driven ways to answer that question. I just didn't have time to prepare them for this meeting. Which I should clarify, they're very long and time intensive. It's not like I could have it in 2 weeks or something.
Mr. Chair, one last question for Dr. Garbinen. So taxing luxury properties on a higher rate, how would that help affordable housing?
So it would help in two ways, right? At least I believe it would help in two ways. One is that you would have all this additional revenue from taxation that you then would appropriately invest in as amenities for lower income populations. To me, the primary one being subsidized housing, right? So you use the additional property tax revenue from adding a progressive structure to invest heavily in mission-driven, county-owned, state-owned, a million different ways to structure it, rental housing that our market just simply does not produce it any other way. Even through filtering, houses get recycled back up through renovation long before they reach the bottom quintile of our rental market. So that's sort of number one, is that you've created all this new revenue for the investment in allowing those families, all of whom are local families, to stay local. The other factor is that as I think was pointed out by the previous commentator, if you tax something, it declines in value, right? And that's a nuisance for existing homeowners, right? But it's actually something we want to see. If we want affordable housing in our county that isn't all subsidized, right, then we need a mechanism by which we can control the fact that over the last 30 years, appreciation has outpaced inflation by a couple percentage points every year. And when you tax it, it declines in value. Now, for folks who already can afford their mortgages or in those homes, that's not a huge issue. They get a little less back when they sell, but they are going to have plenty of appreciation and value in their homes when they do. But it means that for renters who are able to make the jump into home ownership, because it's valued less, then the barriers to home ownership are reduced, right? So sort of the down payment situation and so forth. So you're able to resolve that to some degree. Now, that really sort of also depends on how aggressive you're being with your taxation. And if you're only taxing $100 million homes, there's that's a whole separate sort of market from that's not a decline in the value of $100 million homes is not going to impact home ownership attainment, right? But if you're in the $1 million, $2 million, $3 million mark, it's plausible that you could benefit new homeowners, potential homeowners, simply by taxing properties, right? Because their monthly payment goes up, of course, because they're paying a higher tax. But the primary barrier to entry into home ownership in Honolulu is down payment, entry costs, essentially, right? Getting qualified for the mortgage, all of those things. So that trade-off is beneficial, and then and given today's interest rates, actually that trade-off is pretty substantially beneficial when I've run some numbers on it.
Thank you.
Doctor, by lowering the Commissioner Wong again, Doctor, by lowering the entry cost but increasing the cost of home ownership down the line, would there be any impact or any concern about not whether or not people get into the housing market, but whether they can stay in the housing market after they get over that entry level hump?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of a rain cloud with being too enthusiastic about promoting home ownership across the income spectrum. I remember 2009, 8, 9, and what happened there. So there is always that concern. But I think the folks for whom this, progressive taxation on owner-occupied properties, the folks for whom that value decline would benefit, those are the marginal renters who are almost ready for home ownership anyway. We're not talking about necessarily extending home ownership through a subsidy or something even further down to folks whose jobs are more volatile, who are more likely to lose income. The other choice, of course, with the revenue that you generate from a more progressive housing property tax system is that you can use it directly to help people move into home ownership as well. There's always trade-offs there. I tend to favor the folks who most desperately need it, which are the folks who need deeply affordable rental housing. But there's revenue could be used in either case to sort of sustain low income or even very low income home ownership if you're so inclined.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, one last question here.
I'm noticing Commissioner Stormo Gibson. Did you have a question? Were you raising your hand?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Commissioner Gibson.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Garboden, for that data. It was really helpful. I guess I had a couple of just clarifying things. I know you've talked about progressive taxation on owner-occupied properties. I'm assuming, would the benefits be the same if it's a non-owner occupied property, if it's just on those homes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I think, if you're looking at valuation per unit, which of course is the very important sort of division to do if you're thinking about taxing rental properties, because you don't want to tax a 100-unit property as though it were a single-family home worth that same amount.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the sort of obvious just calculative benefit. I think a highly progressive property on essentially luxury rentals, I don't see a huge market problem with that. Those are, if those were to move into condominiums or something like that, I don't think it would affect, the bulk, as I showed in that distribution, the bulk of renters, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but almost all rental households earn below 100,000, earn below the median income in Honolulu. And so, a structure that picks up that long tail of maybe, say tech workers who come and rent a place in Kakako and are paying, $7K a month in rent, and it's obviously luxury consumption for them. If a property tax rate could be structured to tax those folks, I don't see a problem with it. My concern is, sort of given equivalent incomes, taxing rental properties specifically more harshly than home ownership, and almost all renters fall below almost all homeowners on the income spectrum. And so just being wary of that. But yeah, no, I think taxation of luxury rentals, again, with the usual definitional problems, is a perfect, would not create the same issues that I talked about for the taxing of other rental properties.
I'm curious, is there any data, you've mentioned how definitely most renter households, even dual income, are earning below 100K. Is there some sort of analysis of they're mostly in properties that are worth less than $1 million or something like that?
That's a good question. I mean, my sense is that, because of, $1 million per unit. That's a good question. There's not a great source of data because when your renters don't know the value of the home they're renting, right? Just to full disclosure, neither do homeowners, but we trust their assessments a little better on surveys, right, than we trust renters. So it would really need to be it would have to be a more complex analysis where you're essentially merging data on renters with property tax records, and of course, data on records is highly protected for the Privacy Act. So I don't have a great assessment of that. You could sort of attempt to sort of. The short answer is not easily. The long answer is there might be some ways to get a decent estimate of that question. It's a very important one.
So then, assuming, it's hard to get an exact estimate. We do know that they're definitely low on the lower income spectrum. I'm curious, and I hear what you're saying about how, well, two things. One question is, in terms of, you said 15 to 50% of the tax would likely be passed on to a renter.
I mean, that's what the studies show, yeah.
I'm assuming that if you go down the spectrum to lower income renters, then it's on the higher end. And as you go up to higher you know, apartments renting for $4,000, maybe that incidence actually falls, right? Because they have more options and can run from it. Is that, or?
Yeah, so one of the things that there's the amount of, and the reason that range 15 to 50 is so wide is that it's really complicated to figure out what percentage of a new tax is passed on to renters. One of the things that for sure dictates the percentage of the tax that gets passed on to renters is mobility, right? The renter's ability to essentially say taxes have gotten too high, rental, you know, in this area, my landlord wants to raise the rent, I can go somewhere else. That then decreases demand, which then forces the landlord to charge back to their original rent if they want to have their unit occupied, right? You know, in Honolulu, the big issue is, of course, that our renters have a huge cost associated with moving out of the county, right? If they want, you know, if you live in the middle of Massachusetts and you want to change your local property tax structure, you need to move like 3 miles down the road to an identical house, right? And have better or worse schools or something like that. You know, here, obviously, you leave the metro, you leave the state, you know, you're another victim of our current system in terms of your inability to stay here. So our folks are very stuck, right? So if the landlords can raise rent or have more market power essentially to raise rents if they choose to, especially if all landlords across the state or the county are taxed equally, then then there's no necessarily an option for you know, people to break away on that, compete. So yeah, that's one of the main factors. And as you say, higher income renters are certainly more mobile and potentially would have less of it passed. We also, I mean, yeah, an ideal structure, right, is that you would tax, and this creates huge problems for administration and implementation. An ideal structure would, rather than worrying about the value of the property, because if a landlord owns a $10 million property, but they're renting it for $2,000 a month, that should be something that's somewhat encouraged, right? Because then they're certainly not rent seeking. You know, it should really be based on rents, right? And so someone who can afford $7,000 a month for a 2-bedroom or something, you know, they can, like everyone else, absorb a higher portion of the tax, have more ability to sort of like exercise mobility if they choose, you know, in the face of higher rents.
I know that Maui County, it's under, it's in process right now, but they have created a separate category for long-term renters, a separate tax category, and they have asked that landlords submit lease agreements.
Yeah.
As a way to validate that they have a long-term renter. Do you think that type of structure would make sense?
I mean, it depends on, you know, I feel like if you're, it's really, you know, my opinion is that it's really important to avoid a regressive tax structure that harms renters, right? And so giving folks who are renting below market a break is one thing, but I think overall, because the vast majority of rental properties are targeting the lower income and lowest income portions of our population, that, you know, you want to create no disincentive for having not just affordable renters, but rental properties in general, right? So rental property that's renting at market price is also a precious commodity in Honolulu, right? And one that we're all very worried over the last 6 months and over the next 6 months, we're going to lose in the wake of COVID and all that. And so I'd want to make sure that however it was structured, I'm not familiar with the details on the Maui proposal there, that you're not creating that gradient between this house is already worth a lot more if I sold it, but I don't, you know, I want to hold on for appreciation or something. If you add more taxes to that, you're going to push some landlords over that threshold, right? And they're going to sell their property out into the homeownership market. So anyway, it depends on the details is my answer to that question.
But if they're not, if a property does not have a long-term renter in it, there's really no downside to increase.
Oh yeah, if it's a vacation rental, if it's empty, if it's, you know, one of those, you know, vacant units that people are just holding as an investment or, you know, as a summer home, just that provides no economic value. I just tax it, you know, 100% of its value. I mean, that's obviously absurd, but tax it as high as you want. You won't harm the economy. You won't harm local folks. It's a pretty easy decision to make. assuming you can figure out which are empty, right? Which is the typical challenge with those types of programs. But I feel like we can figure that out now with technology.
Okay. For the sake of our agenda, I think that we're going to have to unfortunately move on. Dr. Garbodin, that's super fascinating. Thank you for taking the time to present to us and take questions. I'm thinking we might benefit again as we're getting further into the weeds and developing our recommendations. Like I asked the testifier before you, would you be willing to take on more questions should they arise in the next couple months?
Surely, yeah. I'm very excited that this commission exists, and I'm really glad you guys are thinking about this. So I'm happy to help in any way.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Garbodin. Commissioners, our next presentation will be from Mrs. Ellen Carson, Esquire, regarding an empty homes tax ordinance proposal submitted on behalf of Faith Action, Community Equity, and its Housing Task Force. Mrs. Carson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm going to segue directly from what Dr. Garbodin was just speaking of, because our proposal is the same that you've seen earlier from Crossroads Church that's now been adopted by Faith Action House now, which is for an empty homes tax. And what it's doing is proposing a tax policy change that would look at our crises in affordable housing and homelessness and do the adjustments to tax policy that are needed to be able to help address both of those problems. And it can be done through shifts in tax policies. So the things that would help in regards to the housing really directly feed off of the testimony you've just heard. And that is that it can help be able to convert thousands of currently vacant units into long-term housing units so that people who live in Hawaii will actually have a place to live. It can help reduce the speculation and investment that are causing our increasing property prices in Hawaii. It can help diminish the rental prices for those at the bottom of the economic ladder who need to rent, because having a greater supply of housing is exactly what's needed to help reduce the demand that's causing the rental prices to go up and up beyond any type of sustainable means. And then finally, it should be able to raise substantial revenues to be able to address affordable housing and homelessness if the funds are earmarked for that, which is what we are proposing for that. The comment that Dr. Garbodin just made, one of them was a particular interest to me, that if successful, the tax would not bring in any revenues because you would convert all of the housing. If that is so, we do have tens of thousands of vacant units in Hawaii, and it would be a major way to create housing immediately with no construction permits, no permit delays, and no taking of additional land. So we could keep the country and be able to use the housing that we have for the purpose for which it was supposed to be designed, to actually be able to live in. So what we've done in the testimony that I've submitted on behalf of Housing Now for Faith Action is to be able to tell you the things that through our analysis we believe to be the key features or essential ingredients for a successful empty homes tax. And you'll note that it's quite different from the proposal that's embodied in Bill 76, which is a vacant home tax that's structured very differently. The reason that it's so different is because we believe that a different structure is needed, and that Bill 76 would not be a successful vehicle for the county to try to accomplish the goals that we are addressing. We do believe the tax rate should be substantial, not confiscatory. We're not trying to have 100% of these units turned over to long-term housing, but it would be good to have tens of thousands of the units turned over. That would still leave probably tens of thousands that are not turned over, but that would be paying much higher tax, that could be funding regularly at substantial levels a revenue source for affordable housing projects and for services for homelessness, so that we could meet those crises, and again, without having disruption to local people who are renting or owning their own home. We do believe that the tax should apply to all residential properties unless there is a specific exemption. And this too is different from Bill 76, which is only aimed toward particular types of residential property, but leaves out many types of residential property. And we do believe that the tax should apply to apartment dwellings, because that is where many of the most affordable properties are that are being left vacant or used for short-term rental, whereas they could be used for long-term rental if the tax were applied on an apartment by apartment basis, just as we currently apply taxes on a condo by condo basis. We think it's important, based on past circumstances particularly, to make sure that there are funds available for the tax department to have sufficient staffing and sufficient expertise and hardware and software to be able to implement a program like this. In the past, it's not been funded, and obviously you can't have an existing system without funding for adequate staffing in the tax department. And for something like this, it is a change that's going to require some new software, some new hardware, and we're suggesting that at least 5%, that up to 5% of revenues from this tax on an annualized basis be available to the tax department for the implementation and enforcement costs. So it can be an effective tax that is well administered with the type of support that it would need. And the exemptions, as for exemptions, the primary ones would cover everyone who's a long-term resident here, which would be anyone who owns their own home, who leases or rents a property, or who is simply a permitted occupier of a property, as is often true for our extended families here and many of the communities where one family supports another by allowing them to live in a second dwelling that they may have control over. So all of those could be things that would be exempted from the tax, but the thing that the tax would be oriented toward and levied upon would be those units that are not used for a principal home for someone in Hawaii for at least 6 months a year. And that would apply to the short-term rentals, the vacant properties, the blighted properties, and others of that nature. The implementation, we believe, is, well, very strongly believe, is best done in a retrospective manner. And this is different from Bill 76 too, because Bill 76 fits into the current classification and rate schedule, where everything is looked at prospectively. Predictions are made prospectively for how that property will be used, and then the tax is applied accordingly. That's not a good way at all when you're talking about vacant or empty homes tax, because there would be almost complete evasion. I think I could almost promise that, whether it's well-intended or not, that people would think, oh no, I'm not going to have that tax apply to me, so I'm going to say that my dwelling is going to be occupied in the next year in order to escape the tax. Whereas a retrospective application of tax, which is what we're requesting, allows simply a truthful declaration. Was this property occupied or not for at least 180 days of a rental or occupancy during the past year? And if so, swear to that so that it can be a statement that is either true or false and can be provable if it is false by an implementation and enforcement that allows evidence to be collected on that. But it could be administered simply by a declaration in the beginning. And that's modeled on the Vancouver empty homes tax, which appears to be the most effective one worldwide at this point in terms of how they're administered. So I'll end there in terms of just my summary, because I've submitted you details on what we believe the essential features to be, and also a proposal that we've worked out with many more details, primarily for the purpose of just assisting you and the City Council in understanding what it would look like so that you can compare it with Bill 76 and with the other classifications that currently exist. You can kick the wheels and be able to say, gee, does that make sense? Is that something that's workable? How effective will that be? And I believe that with further study of it, that it will be shown to have substantial advantages over the current tax structure and be something that could address multiple major crises that we have that have not been effectively addressed and that really deserve changes that tax policy can do to meet that. So I stand available for any questions or for further assistance and research if that's useful to you.
Chair, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Carson, for that presentation. We really appreciate all the value you're providing to this discussion. We appreciate that. And Before we go to questions, I'd like to allow Mr. John Kawamoto to testify briefly, if he would, on his, he provided, hello, Mr. Kawamoto, how are you? You provided some written testimony. So we do have your written testimony, so I don't think there's a need to really go over that unless you have something additional you want to say.
Thank you for the opportunity for this brief testimony. I support the empty homes tax and Ellen Carson's version of the empty homes tax. And all I'd like to add is that it would shift the focus of Hawaii's housing development industry away from luxury homes and toward homes for residents, because it creates this disincentive for luxury homes. So in the long term, more homes that are available for Hawaii residents at prices affordable to Hawaii residents will be created. Okay, thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Kawamoto. So commissioners, any questions for Mrs. Carson and or Mr. Kawamoto?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is Jack Legal. Really just, I think Steve Takara is still on the call, right? Steve?
He is, I see him there, yes.
Yeah, I just have a question for him because...
sorry, Commissioner Legal, if you have a question for the presenters, I would ask that you ask them their questions. If you have questions for Mr. Takara, we can take those later.
Okay, probably this is probably a question for the presenter, and then I don't know if Mr. Takara can just chime in, because definitely this requires the 5% toward administrative staff. So this is going to be a dedicated staff. I'm just wondering if additional staff in the budget of fiscal services. And also certainly it's another, because it may not be that much, like they're sending the tax assessment now. It seems like they're going to be sending the forms of what do you call that thing to
the declaration.
Declaration, yeah, the declaration forms. They'll be sending that during also the tax season, right, Ms. Carson?
Yes, at some point.
At some point, yeah.
It would not need to be at the same time as the current tax forms, but it could be if that is more efficient for the tax department division.
And this a clarification, and this declaration is basically asking them if this property was occupied last year for 180 days, the previous year. Yeah.
That is the only way that a truthful or false statement can be made. Is not a prediction of what's happening next year, which there's no way to prove truth or falsity of that, but a statement as to last year. What was the status of this property in regards to occupancy?
Okay, thank you. One more. Just on the exemptions on 2.3, you list a lot of exemptions here, like pending litigation.
Right.
How about foreclosure, property in foreclosure? Because sometimes they're vacant,
Sometimes they are vacant, and I have not tried to propose the minutia of any of those exemptions, but generally the thought was that at some point having a property in litigation often means that the title is in a legal cloud, or that it is not habitable legally, or that someone else is going to have control of it in the immediate future. So a foreclosure occurring right now could very well mean that the property is no longer habitable, and that could be an exemption. We're trying to create equitable exemptions, but not ones that create ability for abuse and prolonged efforts to keep a property from being taxed when it's truly vacant.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Any other commissioners with questions for the presenters or the presenter? Commissioner Stormo Gibson, yep. I see your hand up.
Thank you, Ms. Carson, for pulling out that example from Vancouver. I just wonder, because it seems like there's a couple options, which is the, basically a form, a declaration form, or requiring a lease agreement. And I don't know if that has in Vancouver, if they've weighed that at all, or if they decided it was too much of a burden to ask for a lease agreement, or if that
Okay.
yeah, pros and cons of that came up.
Right. I think the strategy that Vancouver has chosen is a simple declaration that can be filled out in less than 5 minutes. It's online for people, and it simply asks for a declaration in regards to what the status of the property was. And if an exemption is claimed, you check off which exemption you claim you were qualified for in the prior year. Then at any point in the future for several years, the same is true when you file your taxes, the tax division has the ability to be able to do an audit and to do any type of investigation in terms of driving by to see what it looks like. So that is the means by which it decided to have very inexpensive implementation on the front end, and then have targeted enforcement based on certain strategies of where they are most likely to find people who are trying to abuse the system. And that is the point at which they require documentary proof. But they're not trying to require everybody to submit rental agreements. And I think given our extended families in Hawaii, that we would, if we decided to do it that way, which it could be done that way, we would want to make sure that for those communities where there is multi-generational living that is spread out over multiple homes owned by one person, and there's no rent going back and forth because it's family owned, by permission, occupied by long-term residents of Hawaii. We just want to make sure that we have something to account for that.
That's a good point. Would you be able to send us a copy of their declaration form? I'm just curious if they ask for like the renter's name or phone number or anything like that.
I can get you what I can get. I've had correspondence with their officials and have not yet been able to get the specific copy of the form itself, but I do have the information. So let me get as much of that as I can to you.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I'll provide that to the chair. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Actually looking at the council chambers, any commissioners in council chambers with questions? I hope we're not missing questions from you all.
As Vice Chair Wong, I have one question for either Ms. Carson or Mr. Kawamoto. How would a retrospective audit work? Would it require an examination of prior documentation, or would it require a sort of preemptive audit on behalf of the tax administration to go by and see if these homes are actually vacant and then matching it with a subsequent declaration after the fact?
Right. The implementation in that means would be to ask for a variety of evidence in regards to who occupied it, sworn statements as to what their time period of occupancy was, proof of that occupancy by something like a lease agreement or by other proof that they had, for example, were using it for their bank accounts or for their utilities or things of that nature. So they can rely upon documentary proof and evidence. They can rely upon going by and visiting. So if they have suspicion of particular units that are vacant, they can be able to go by and check and see whether they are vacant and make extrapolation from that. But the burden of proof would be upon the person claiming the exemption.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I should let you finish, sorry.
Oh, but the burden of proof would be upon the person claiming the exemption.
Got it. I guess my follow-up question to that is what would be a reasonable means, or I guess a reasonable, factor in the consideration of who gets audited? Would it just be at random, or what would, constitute that reasonable suspicion, for a lack of a better term?
Right. Well, I'd say whatever the tax division is using now is strategies that have been developed, but I would suggest that for this particular one, low-hanging fruit is the cheapest way to go in terms of buildings that have large numbers of unoccupied units, places that are dark night after night. Blighted properties, of which we have spread around the island, are obviously vacant at all times. And being able to identify those and go after those in the very beginning with some media publicity and things that help people know that there's teeth to the law, and then working up the chain from there. It depends upon what the revenue amount is that's received in the enforcement desire in terms of how vigorous to be with enforcement. There's a balance somewhere. You're not trying to get 100% of the cheaters. I think you're trying to get enough that you encourage those of good faith to make good faith declarations.
Mr. Kawamoto, anything to add?
I think Ellen covered it all. Thank you.
No, thank you both. Appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Carson, for your presentation, and thank you, Mr. Kawamoto, for your testimony at the end there. With that, I mean, I think so. Commissioner Legal, I think we'll have ample opportunity to query Administrator Takara on these ideas at another time. I think for the sake of time, I'd like to recommend we move on in our agenda.
Sure, no problem.
Thank
no problem,
you.
Mr. Chair. Yeah.
Okay. Turning now to updates from our subcommittees. Commissioner Pham, on behalf of the Classifications and Rates Subcommittee, would you care to share with us an update?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So circulated to all the commissioners was a written report of a meeting that the Subcommittee on Rates and Classifications held on October 15th. We discussed 3 topics. We had the intention of also discussing the residential A tiering and qualification questions, but we didn't have the data that came in this week, so we didn't really discuss that. Regarding the vacant residential properties and Bill 76, the subcommittee does not recommend Bill 76. Instead recommends the empty homes proposal, the one that Ms. Carson just testified on. And the reasons for that include the prospective versus retrospective nature of determining the tax, and having this tax being leveraged as a supplemental tax as opposed to using the existing classification system and shifting a property between vacant residential versus residential A or residential, and having that be misaligned with its actual use. The next thing that we discussed was the policy subcommittee's proposal to have 4 different classifications for residential instead of the current residential and residential A classifications. We suggested that to be consistent with our recommendation for the empty homes proposal, the empty homes tax proposal, that we reduce this to 3 classifications, which would be owner occupied, long-term rented, and short-term rented, and to have each of these 3 classifications include a tiering structure as was suggested by the policy subcommittee. There was an example provided in the written report. The rates and the cutoffs for the tiers are just an example, and they're not indicative of any recommendation. And finally, we discussed the land value tax study and what potential objectives would be. The objectives primarily of what we would try to get at with a land value tax study include modeling the effects of the land value tax using localized data to Honolulu County. As Mr. Gearing testified earlier during the meeting, a better way to phrase this would be to model the comparison between our current equal rate system versus a land value tax, and potentially a split rate land value tax at 60-40 versus 90-10, things like that. There were some other things that were listed and concerns that were discussed about making sure that the study is including determinations on potential impacts to minority and low-income populations, the equity effects, the effects on agriculturally zoned land, the effects on urban corridor versus rural areas, and things of that nature. So that is what was provided in the written report.
Chair, if you can unmute, or I might be able to know.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Pham. Is there also an update for the credits and exemption subcommittee? And keep in mind, we do have the written report, so you could just like briefly summarize if you want, for the sake of time.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, the credits and exemption subcommittee, we met, or we didn't meet, we had 2 phone calls to discuss a few recommendations. A lot of the recommendations had to do with the 2019 commission recommendations, in which we wish to propose readopting a few of these. I did see in the testimony for today's meeting that there were comments regarding the 2019 recommendation about repealing the credit union exemption. And that was one of the things that was listed for discussion. There was also testimony submitted today about childcare centers, specifically the for-profit childcare center exemption. That was a commission recommendation from 2019. And we also outlined some new issues for 2021 for this commission that have to do with the minimum real property tax, since there were multiple recommendations about raising that from 300 to 1,000 for some of the specific categories, but instead maybe discussing that as a whole, as well as some questions that came up about nonprofit thrift shops. If we were going to be scrutinizing the charitable exemptions, then we would want to take a look at this as well, just because it's in the same topical area. Want to point out on the charitable exemptions issue, we didn't have a recommendation for the commission about a particular direction. We saw that there were 2 reasonable ways to go, and one is to make the exemption about catching all nonprofits and nonprofit purposes, and having a more narrow definition of charitable purposes that's in line with the IRS's 501c3 designation. As it's currently worded, the exemption is titled charitable purposes, but it seems to include a lot of other nonprofit activity. And then there were a few others regarding low-income housing, one in which we think there may be an ability to gain efficiency by aligning the language for that exemption for low-income rental housing with what Kauai County does, as well as an open discussion regarding properties that are rented to Section 8 housing choice voucher holders. There was testimony submitted for today's meeting regarding that, encouraging us to really discuss that. So that is what we have. The rest you can read in the written report.
Now, I should say we should open up for discussion on both the classifications and rates and credits and exemptions reports. If any commissioners have questions or comments related to either of those subcommittees, sorry for pulling those, doing those together, but I missed the discussion on the last one. Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Commissioner Pham, for the update. I think we'll have more opportunity to discuss these these reports, as well as any future recommendations that come out of your report in the coming meetings that we have. So we'll be sure to keep those in mind. On behalf of the policy subcommittee, is there any update? I don't think we met. I don't think the policy subcommittee met. So I think we can move on to the evaluation subcommittee. Vice Chair Wong, is there any update from the evaluation subcommittee?
Good afternoon, everybody. Vice Chair Wong here. The valuation subcommittee met in person on October 20th, 2021. Discussed at the meeting were the two recommendations of the previous commission's findings in its report. One was the lack of transparency of the valuation process, and the second was the income methodology and how it applies to valuation going forward. After discussions at our meeting, the subcommittee found that both topics were still relevant to taxpayers in Honolulu today, and felt that there were still additional matters that were not investigated as much as the prior commission wanted to. Finding those things, the subcommittee would like to pose 3 questions to the Real Property Assessment Division in writing to be answered. The first is to provide a complete sampler of a hypothetical property valuation for a residential classified property. It was discussed at the meeting, and we had concerns that citizens and county residents need to know how their properties are being valued, especially with the rising home prices, with inflation, and with the role that housing plays today in today's narrative in the media. It's important that residents understand what happens when their properties are valued. So having a hypothetical appraisal of a property present and available to members of the public would certainly help them understand that. We investigated and we looked at certain other cities that were in the country that in their assessors' web pages, and in those web pages, such as the city of Denver and I think Seattle, Washington, we looked at, they had materials available that were there helping the county residents or the city residents understand exactly the process of how properties were valued. So because valuation is crucial, especially when we talk about residential A, because there is a tier and there is a benchmark there that needs to be met. Valuation is important, and residents who have their assessments issued to them need to know and understand how their properties are valued. So explaining this with a hypothetical would be greatly appreciated, and I think it'd be informative and instructive for the entire commission going forward. The second question that we would like to pose to the Real Property Assessment Division is how specifically does the city and county use the income method for valuation of commercial, industrial, and hotel classifications? The prior commission found that the income method was not adopted or recognized by assessors in appeals of certain properties. However, it does remain a USPAP certified and recognized way of appraisal. And because appraisers are educated and they are aware of the methodology involved here and the factors and variables involved, taxpayers should be able to use whatever means are available at their disposal to appeal a property valuation. I think the goal, and I think the whole subcommittee agreed that the entire goal of a property appraisal and the assessment is to arrive at the proper value, not the highest or the lowest value, but to really investigate when it comes down to it and find the correct value going forward. And having another method of appraisal at everybody's disposal would only help taxpayers going forward. The final matter that we'd like to pose to the Real Property Assessment Division concerned the application of the Marshall and Swift manual. Based on the appendix to last year's or the previous commission's report, there were concerns raised about the application of the Marshall and Swift cost manual. And as discussed in a prior meeting, only in a cursory moment, the cost manual applies to the valuation and appraisal of improvements on property, not the land values, but the improvements such as buildings and structures thereupon. Finding the cost valuation is a confusing process, to say the least, for many taxpayers. They're not aware of how costs are determined. They're not aware of where these cost figures come from, and they're not aware of how their house is valued. The previous commission documented lengthy exchanges with the Real Property Assessment Division and to their investigation as to how the manual is being applied and what the assumptions and the explanations of the model are and how they apply to a taxpayer's valuation. And many of those were not answered at the end of the prior commission's report. So going forward, I think the subcommittee found that it was the obligation of this commission as well to go forward and continue the investigation and to continue asking whether or not the Marshall and Swift manual is still being applied and what the methodology and the assumptions and the type of methodology is applied in those valuations going forward to people's buildings and improvements.
Thank you, Vice Chair Wong. I'll open it up for discussion.
Mr. Chair, this is Jack Legal. Vice Chair Wong, you probably run into this thing because you do a lot of appeals as well. One of the confusing things now for the property owners is also evaluating the leasehold properties. They don't know the methodology. It's very confusing, you know. And recently in our tax appeal board, we've been bombarded with questions about leasehold properties and things like that. And the way the tax or the city do the valuation for leasehold property is to do it as a fee simple. So a lot of homeowners didn't understand that methodology. So I think there need to be a lot of explanation on how to do it, you know. This is just an observation.
Thank you, Commissioner Legal. Hearing that, I would, just based on my own experience, this isn't pertaining to any individual case, but I would assume that the valuations of the properties are all based on the fee of the property, but the taxpayer and the person responsible for the actual assessment and the debt on the property, that's handled through a contractual process. That's just based on my past experience. I could be wrong, but I certainly do agree that any transparency into the valuation of leasehold properties and to explain to leasehold renters that they still may be liable under the contracts that they execute or under their leasehold documents. I think that that's important, and that there can be measures taken to affect that and to educate them on that.
Yeah, I think so, because it's really difficult, especially if the fee interest is not available, you know, in a building. So you have nothing to base it on. So they just throw a number in there as fee simple and things like that. And taxpayers said, how did you come up with these things, you know? So education is certainly, I think, education is really a must, I think, on this one, you know, clarifications, whatever, you know, hypothetical example, methodology, whatever it is that you're proposing, you know, that would be good. Thanks, Chair Wong. Vice Chair Wong, thank you.
Thank you.
So Chair Mould, this is Commissioner Aide White. So Vice Chair, to confirm, there are 3 particular questions, and I will confirm the specific wording with you and your fellow subcommittee members, but the 3 questions are what you would like submitted to the Real Property Administration Division.
That is correct. Yes.
Great, thank you very much, Vice Chair Wong. With that, sorry for the shorter discussion. Is there any more discussion of this from commissioners? Again, we can always circle back if further questions arise in our next meeting. I'll make sure, you know, given the intense presentations that we got, I think it's warranted to be able to circle back to some of this stuff. So commissioners, turning, is that okay? Can we move on to the next item?
Yes.
Commissioners, turning to our next discussion item, we received yesterday a response to our initial set of queries to the administration and the Real Property Assessment Division. Hopefully you all have had an opportunity to review those responses. I would like to open the floor to discussion on them. And I'll note that thank you, Administrator Takara, for the timely response. We appreciate that. And I see that you're here on our call right now. So thank you for being here. I guess I'll just, I mean, this is related to something Commissioner Legal was alluding to earlier. You know, there's that question of what do you need to implement, you know, various provisions, including a potential vacancy or empty homes tax. Note that, like, when we have, you know, to your point, when we have more structure and when there's a more specific recommendation, we hope we can come back to you with that question to find out what resources you would need to implement any potential recommendations.
Yeah, that'll be great. I mean, um, just to comment that, you know, very interesting, very, you know, well, you know, discussed topics, and this, you know, council member says here as well, you know, I think that you guys are, I don't know, right on the money doing you guys research and having guest speakers and expert, you know, people to speak on these topics. But when it comes to that vacant or empty homes tax, you know, there are, it's a good concept. I don't disagree with that, but I think there's things to be ironed out. You know, one of them is, like I keep saying or asking for definitions of what is occupied, what is unoccupied, that definition, as well as identification. You know, I'm hearing tens of thousands. You know, if we get like a list of 1,000 or 2,000, you know, can we just manually check that? You know, and the process itself, you know, there's speak of a certification or declaration. So with the, you know, we have 260,000 residential properties. You know, about 150 or so, 150,000 have home exemptions. So we're talking about 110,000 properties that could be, you know, eligible for this class. How do we weed that out each year? You know, yeah, it's only a 5-minute thing. But is the default, you're in the empty tax? So whoever doesn't reply falls into that category? Or is it the other way around? I guess I'm just saying, you know, I don't want to talk about it in detail and take up too much, but I'm just saying that thank you for the conversation, and yeah, I think there's room for work, improvement, and clarity on it, and we can talk about it offline or whatever.
Great, thank you, we appreciate that. Definitely will be, you know, want to hear what, you know, what recommendations or suggestions you would have to improve anything that comes out of our committee, whether it's the empty homes tax or any other recommendation. So appreciate your time, Administrator Takara. And I should say welcome, Speaker Say, to the call. Great to have you here as well. Thank you. So we'll move on for the sake of time, unless there are other questions for Commissioner Stormo Gibson. Yeah, do you have a comment or a question? Are you on? I think you might be on mute.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Deputy Takara, for being here. I wanted to, and it was great to get the answers to some of these, you know, questions. And I was curious about question 11, which was the ones that are not Res A, right? For which reasons? And I understand if they're under $1 million, that's pretty clear. But there was this other number, which is 68,000 if you include condo units. Is there something about a condo that means it wouldn't be Res A?
Yeah, so again, there's overlap, right? So, you know, so you have properties, you know, in ag or even industrial that have home exemptions and stuff like that. So you have properties that overlap. So, you know, to equal the 96,000 or so, you know, because you have properties that is ineligible for Res A because, you know, could be the zoning as well as the value.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Carry more units. So that's why, you know, there's overlap there.
I see. So but if you are a condo unit, you cannot fall into Res A?
No, you can.
Oh, okay.
But then there, you know, there's
oh, some condos on like ag land or something.
Correct.
Okay.
And then you have industrial properties that have home exemptions. I mean, again, it's pretty intense, but, you know, if the question is, you know, why are they not? It
Hmm.
yeah, there's overlap. Could be the zoning. I mean, the value, the zoning, and the number of units. So
Hmm. Hmm.
they don't
Okay,
solely fall into each category. There's overlap.
I see. Right. So there, yeah, because if you add up those numbers, of course, you get like, I don't know, 173,000, but there's only about 100 or something. So, interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, if you look at like number one, we're saying that there's about 100,000 that have less than $1 million value.
Right.
Then there's 68,000 that is not because they're in apartment zone or ag, right? So there's a lot in apartment zone. There's a lot of condos in apartment zones.
Oh, and if it's in an apartment zone, just from being in an apartment zone, it will not be listed as Res A.
Yeah, because of the definition of residential is residential zone.
Ooh, okay. I guess this comes back to that conversation on the classification committee of, trying to make it more equitable and more, yeah, less arbitrary. That just seems pretty arbitrary. Okay, thank you for that.
I have a question regarding what was just said about condominium in an apartment zone. Wouldn't that condominium be dedicated as residential, therefore qualify as residential A? Am I misreading the ordinance?
Yes, I guess that's where, what I got to look at it again because it does say condominiums, but then if they're in apartment zoning, okay, take for instance, Pro Ridge. A lot of that cluster in Pro Ridge or across the shopping center is apartment zone A1 or A2. I forget what the actual, or A3 or whatever it is. So, by definition, those are all apartment zone. So they would not fall into the Res A classification. But if you have on a residential, area that is condominiumized and exceeds $1 million, then they would be in the Res A class.
Yeah, and that seems pretty well. I think someone else had something to say, but go ahead.
Any other questions? I'm looking also at the commissioners in council chambers. Want to give you an opportunity.
Nothing in chambers. Chair.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Administrator Takara, commissioners. So for the sake of time, we'll move on to the next agenda item. We have a couple more things. We are at time officially. I apologize for the time management there. We'll try to get through this efficiently here. Our last discussion item on the agenda is our timeline through the remainder of 2021. As has been discussed previously, Resolution 17-112 sets a deadline of December 1st, 2021 to provide recommendations to the Council. However, the Council Chair has indicated that he will extend that date should the Commission request additional time. The Council Chair has also indicated that he hopes the Commission would continue working until June 30th, 2022 until its dissolution. The procedure for reporting recommendations of the Commission typically is a multi-step process. Summary reports and recommendations from the individual subcommittees are submitted and placed on the Commission agenda for public testimony and discussion. Action is then taken upon those subcommittee reports and recommendations at the proximate meeting of the Commission. These recommendations are then incorporated into a draft of a formal report of the Commission to the Council. The draft of a formal report is similarly placed on a commission agenda for public testimony and discussion, with action being taken to approve the draft at the proximate meeting of the commission. Thus, in order to be able to submit a formal report to the council, we as a commission need to meet at least 4 times to accomplish that. I would like to open up discussion to 1, setting a timeline for meetings of the commission over the next 2 months, and propose that anticipate holding meetings at least every 2 weeks through the end of the year. Hey, Commissioner Kutsukara, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes. Sorry. Time out. Sorry to interrupt. I misspoken. I'm reading the definition of residential A, and it for condominiums, it's regardless of the zoning. Apparently, it's in another section. So if it just reads, is a condominium unit an assessed valuation of $1 million or more and does not have a home exemption. So that does not say anything about the underlying zoning for condominium projects. So sorry if I misspoke in there.
So any condominium is on the same terms as Res and Res A.
Subject to Res A.
Yes. Yeah. So right currently, if it's valued over $1 million, it's Res A as a condo.
Without a home exemption.
Without a home exemption.
But not true for single family homes.
Yeah, so single family homes, 2 or less needs to be on a residential zoning. Sorry, yeah. So that's why I kind of misspoke, and I needed to look that up.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying.
So thank you, and I'll bow out. And sorry for interrupting. I gotta go, but thank you, and appreciate all the conversation.
So thank you, Stephen, for joining us. And we hope to see you at these meetings that we're scheduling right today. So we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Right on. Thank you. Have a great weekend, you guys.
You too. Okay, so I would like to open up discussion to 1, setting a timeline for meetings of the commission over the next 2 months, anticipating that we'll need to meet about every 2 weeks. And then what are the priorities of the subcommittees and the commission that we wish to address in our first formal report to the council? And what matters should or could be addressed in a subsequent report to the council later in 2022. So open for discussion. Are we okay with scheduling meetings every 2 weeks between now and the issuance of our report? Yeah, I'm thinking we need a minimum of 4 meetings, but I'm thinking we may need like 6-ish. So we may have to, do every 2 weeks, and then maybe add in a few ad hoc meetings there as the work requires. Are commissioners amenable to that?
I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that approach, Chair. Yeah. We give ourselves a little bit more flexibility just in case we need to, to do the work to meet our goals, to meet our deadlines. Yeah. But we can set fixed dates, and then if needs be, we can meet, Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, that is my recommendation for folks.
And Chair Mould, if I can, given that Budget Chair is present on our call, he has maintained significant interest in the work of the commission. Is it the chair's intent and the commission's intent to ideally get a initial report and recommendations to the council by the new year?
I think that is where we're going, and I think that's what I'm going to recommend, as opposed to shooting for December 1st and maybe maybe rushing something. I mean, maybe we can get some interim items in by December 1st, but I was thinking hopefully we could get until the end of the year of 2021 to submit our report.
Sorry.
George, can I just say a few words?
Chair, Budget Chair.
Please.
Yeah, this is Calvin Say, Chair of the Budget Committee. I'm just so impressed with your articulation of what you folks are doing as far as the real property tax proposals. It's fascinating that, for me, I'm happy that Rocky, you have communicated with Chair Waters that if you folks do want to extend, please do it. Because, yeah, I'd like to see a recommendation from the commission that is a very solid one, rather than having the council just shove it to the side, like what happened with the last Real Property Tax Commission's reports and recommendations. This afternoon, it was fascinating that I think for one of the major priorities would be the openness of transparency of how we do valuation of real property, because when homes are sold adjacent to a neighboring home, and then the neighbor calls me up and says, hey, my property tax values went up by 100,000. Who responds to that particular concern of that particular neighbor who may not be able to afford the increase in their particular valuation? I also just called my staff that we had another issue and that dealt with the one you folks just talked about. How does one determine the valuation of a leasehold condominium whereby they don't know what the valuation process is? And that goes back to where I think Mr. Takara has to be more transparent in coming up with a guideline of this is how we evaluate this particular unit at the one Ala Moana or Park Lane, etc. All I'm trying to get at is that you folks are on track. Just keep it up. I was very much impressed also with the, is it Professor Garvin?
Bowden, yep.
Gordon, yes, and his presentation and the individual before that, because sometimes it's so difficult. You can raise rents, or you can raise, property taxes for homeowners who are rich, but in the end, who do they pass it on to? The renters, whereby you may have a less buying power for the particular individual. But just keep up the good work. I would recommend to all of you that Rocky, being the chair, contact Chair Waters to say maybe the extension could be up till February, March, or April. There is no rush because as of today, Real Tax Division is already trying to get the assessments in determining what the revenue source will look like for the operating budget of the County of Oahu. Because this is going to be in November that they start formulating next year's budget. And that's the discussion we'll have. Another one that is you guys must have heard about it, is when the Department of Budget and Fiscal Services, the Real Property Tax Division, had increased the rate on have you folks heard it? The solar farms?
Yes. Bill 39. Yeah, right?
Right. Yeah, from ag to industrial, whereby it multiplied the real property taxes by maybe 300-fold. And that's the discussion we're going on right now, because in this particular case, we're all proponents for the 2045 non-fossil fuel, the global change as far as energy. But the point I'm trying to get at is it just came up this year. And I was shocked because that was contrary to state policy in regards to achieving 2045, 100% renewables. And I was concerned because I'll probably get a lot of pushback. Why did you folks increase the rates on the solar farms, which is regulated? It's regulated by the Public Utility Commission, from the developer or the landlord, who's the lessor. The lessee is, let's say, Calvin and Calvin. The next step we have to go through is, let's say, to Jack and Kenna, who's the utility, Hawaiian Electric, to come up with our power purchase agreement. And then on to you, Rocky, as far as the PUC. But in the meantime, Calvin and Calvin are stuck that we were of the assumption that it was going to be the agricultural rate in developing our financial plan that we had to present to Hawaiian Electric, which is the utility. And then Hawaiian Utility says, okay, we're going to buy it for this amount of cents per kilowatt. And then HEI then has to go to the PUC for their approval. So I I'm having a hard time to determine what is fair at this point. Because from the beginning, we were of the assumption that it should be the agricultural rate, which it was in the past. So that's the kind of issues I'm trying to deal with at another level, but getting back to real property, it is so important because I need the revenues. And I shared that with the Department of Budget and Fiscal Services Director. When they came in, and you guys probably saw the news, I think George saw the news, a $500,000 shortfall in the lifeguard ocean safety division. So I said to them publicly, I was very irresponsible in passing their budget with this particular shortfall. And the deputy director could not say anything. So keep up the good work. My thoughts would be, there is no need to rush. Work as much as you folks can, but one of the areas I personally feel that would be very beneficial would be the area of the openness and transparency of how we determine the valuation based on your land values and your improvements. And then the question of what, if it's fee or leasehold. It's fascinating for me. This is my 10th month on the job. I never expected to be like this, but to all of you, just keep up the good work. And the reason why, Rocky, I'm a little concerned about two meetings in December is the holidays already.
Right.
New Year, Christmas and New Year's, that particular week at the state legislature before was closed. So you're going to push a lot during the month of November. The last week of November is Thanksgiving, 2 to 3 days, holidays, etc. That's the other issue. But to all of you, thank you very much for your public service and your volunteerism. And for my appointee, he hasn't said anything, but I hope he will get more involved in asking these tough questions also. Thank you. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Kanovich. Say, hope to see you.
Thank you.
I'll see you.
Thank you.
See ya.
Regarding the solar farms, I forwarded Bill 39 to members. So we're gonna take a look at that for sure, and we may actually try to shoot for an earlier recommendation to assist you all with that in the meantime. We'll see.
Rocky, there's a deadline. There's a deadline that Mr. Takara gave us. The deadline is when is it, George? December?
December.
Yeah, December.
I will be, we just provided those two bills, and I will be providing the synopsis of the first hearing so that the commissioners are aware, but we didn't agendize it for today. So I will be providing those,
no problem,
that information regarding Bill 39. And then we also forwarded Bill 41, which was recently introduced. And the commission will take a look just at the first 11 pages, I believe, that are real property tax related.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if in particular we're going to get an extension to February even, then maybe it'll give us some time to take a really quick intense look at that bill before that deadline. So we'll do what we can do.
Great.
We'll
thank you very much.
Yeah, and
George.
thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, this is Janelle. If I may also add to share the testimony, because that Bill 39 is really complex. So the testimony kind of gives a little bit of background that some of the constituents.
Yes, Mr. Denny, thank you. I will do that. I will pull the testimony from the first hearing before the Budget Committee and forward that to the commissioners as well.
Great. And I should disclose that I am in the solar business, but I'm in a different sector of the solar business than those big guys. But we're aligned with them. So I just should disclose that to everyone when we talk about that. So I actually can help explain some of that stuff about the business to folks.
And very briefly, Budget Chair, before we proceed to the scheduling matter, just so you know, Commissioner Peters does speak a great deal in subcommittee meetings. So he speaks quietly, but speaks profoundly many times.
He does. He does.
I will second that.
Yes.
And he has very good ideas.
Okay.
Very good ideas.
George and
Commissioner
Rocky,
Fo and I can testify to that.
okay,
Commissioner Fo, you know.
I was just gonna say, we don't need another duplicate like Governor Ariyoshi, acquired but effective, okay?
Okay. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Chair. Say. Thank you.
So Commissioners, Chair Mold, if I may just keep us moving with regards to your discussion of setting a timeline and the priorities for the subcommittee. I do have the calendar of available dates. If we want to set a handful of dates at this point, that's up to you all. But if you guys want to throw out a few dates, I can let you know. But I'll leave it to your guidance on picking those dates.
Yeah, let's set dates, and I think we can talk about the priorities later at this stage.
Yeah.
Does that work for everyone? Let's
Yeah, that would work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the only dates if we're looking at today as the 22nd of October, the 2 weeks from today would be November 5th, a Friday, but that entire week, November 2nd, 4th, and 5th, the Reapportionment Commission is meeting 3 separate times, but their meeting times are from 4:30 to 8. So we would be able to do our normal meeting time here if any of those times work. The only other dates that I would seek to avoid would be November 10th, November 16th, 17th, and 18th. That's the committee meetings. And then December 1st. Pretty much everything else is wide open, but for the month of November, the 16th, 17th, and 18th are committee meetings. November 10th is the full council meeting, and December 1st is the full council meeting. So those are really the only dates to avoid.
I would like to propose that we do at least three meetings in the month of November.
Let's go 5th.
5th works for me.
No problem.
Maybe the 12th, the following Friday. Well, that's too soon.
But I am out of pocket this Wednesday, the 10th, 11th, and 12th.
So,
Commissioner Legal, with
yes.
regards to agendizing and matters, the only thing I could suggest though is the 5th is no problem, but if we're going to have a meeting on the 12th, then I need to file the agenda on the 5th for the 12th. So if we could do the 15th, that might make it a bit easier or something along those lines, whereby we at least have a little flexibility to know what the agenda will be after we meet on the 5th.
I'd like to propose the 5th, the 15th, and the 29th of November for meetings.
29th, hold on. It's good for me. 5th, 15th, and the 29th.
Okay. And I was realizing might be good to have Maui come, right? Should I follow up on that?
And so we can do ad hoc meetings for stuff like that. So let's, and we could do it all online, right? We can just use a Zoom meeting to have just Maui present,
Yeah.
Well, I guess do we have to be in chambers for ad hoc meetings? No. We just have to make sure that the public can chime in if they want, right?
That's the only thing is that I just need a 6-day heads up. Essentially, I just need to file the agenda 6 days before the ad hoc meeting or any commission meeting. That's all I need.
Is George, is 2 o'clock okay? Same time?
All times work according to whatever works for you.
2 o'clock or?
2 p.m. works.
I think 2 o'clock is pretty good.
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry.
Mhm.
I won't be available on the 5th. I'm so sorry.
Who's that?
Tracy,
Sounds like Tracy.
Commissioner
Tracy.
Dean. Yeah.
You won't be available what day, Tracy?
I am so sorry.
No, you're fine. We
But that's the only day I'm not available. I can make
Would the
myself
4th
available
work?
anytime.
What about the 8th? How about the 8th,
The 4th.
the 15th, and the 29th? How about the 8th, Monday the 8th, the 15th, and the 24th? And the 29th, sorry.
Or
That-
the 4th because I mean, White was saying that just having 7 days between meetings is hard for agendizing, right? So,
You're correct, Commissioner Stormo Gibson, but because it's on a Monday, it's different than the Friday issue. So because if we do the 8th, then that means I can file on the 9th. So that means we complete the meeting on the 8th and Chair and you all can discuss agendizing and we get out the agenda on the 9th for the 15th. So we're fine.
So we'll go November 8th, 15th, and 29th. 2 p.m., right?
That works for me.
Those are acceptable for everybody in
How about
chambers.
other commissioners?
Works to me. I think that works out very nicely because it's all consistent. It's all Mondays.
Everybody in chambers confirms those dates are okay as well.
Okay. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Wong.
So 2 p.m. Yeah, same time.
Beautiful.
Yep.
That seems to work because we eat our lunch and then we have a little bit of rest and then we have a meeting, right?
Yeah. No siestas.
No siesta, man. Okay, that's good.
Okay, so I think that's enough for now. Do you think we should schedule December as well, or just we'll do that as it comes?
I think the commission has done well to get these meetings locked in, and we can set other meetings on the next meeting on the 8th, or whatnot. But
Okay.
I believe we've already set the scheduling of the next meeting and meetings. The only matters, Chair, are you prepared for announcements?
Yeah. Let us move to, so absent objections, those are the next 3 meetings. Yes, let's move on to announcements. Thank you.
Before any
members, are
commissioners-
there any announcements?
Prior to, if commissioners have any announcements, I just wanted to make administrative type announcement of, Chair already mentioned, we did provide you copies of Bill 39 and Bill 41, which were recently introduced, real property tax related matters. They were not agendized, but I will forward you, as Ms. Denny mentioned, the testimony for Bill 39. That may be a more pressing matter, as it appears the Real Property Tax Division is trying to push that matter quickly. So the commission may want to take a closer look at that more quickly. But with regards to Bill 41, that is the Transient Accommodations Bill, or TVU bill, short-term rental bill. It's 40 pages long, but only the first 11 pages are real property tax related. So I did forward those to you, and then we can look at discussing those, or you all can look at discussing those in the coming meetings if you all wish to agendize them. That is all from me, Chair.
Thank you, Commission Aide White. Any other announcements from members? Commissioners, there being no further business today, is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn. Second.
There being no objections, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great weekend.